The loaf of bread, the carton of eggs, the coffee, they're all still there. Yet everything feels slightly pricier, smaller, and with fewer choices. The unsettling part isn't empty shelves. It's when they look full, but the system behind them is quietly changing. No out-of-stock signs, no alerts, just subtle shifts, switching brands, smaller portions, skipping familiar items because prices feel off. Modern shortages aren't obvious or hunger-inducing. They quietly lower expectations. Look closely, and you'll see 12 essential foods under strain worldwide. This isn't a loud crisis, it's a slow tightening of the system. 12. Arabica coffee. Picture this. You walk into your usual supermarket one morning and suddenly notice that the coffee you've been buying for the past 20 years is gone. There's no explanation, no sign, no announcement, just a small, almost unnoticeable empty space where it used to sit. Coffee might not be essential for survival, but it shapes your daily routine. It's that quiet, comforting pause before the day really begins. It's part of what makes everything feel steady and familiar. Arabica, the world's most popular type of coffee, also happens to be one of the most temperature-sensitive crops out there. Countries like Brazil and Colombia, which supply a huge portion of the world's coffee, have been dealing with repeated climate challenges in recent years. Droughts, unexpected frosts, and periods of intense rainfall. Even a slight change in temperature, just a few degrees, can significantly impact how much coffee is produced. When production drops, prices naturally start to climb. As those prices rise, retailers begin to adjust by cutting down their variety, focusing only on the products that sell the fastest. Meanwhile, smaller or less popular brands quietly disappear from the shelves. Coffee itself doesn't suddenly vanish, but the specific one you've depended on for years becomes harder to find. Or it's still available, just packaged in a smaller size and sold at a higher price. This is how the system slowly tightens, not with loud warnings or sudden changes, but through subtle reductions that happen year after year. For someone living on a fixed income, a small price increase here and there might not seem like a big deal at first. But when several everyday items go up at the same time, that financial cushion starts to shrink. Coffee is just one example of a global commodity that depends heavily on stable weather and a complicated supply chain. If something as routine as your morning cup can be disrupted by minor temperature shifts, then the real concern isn't just coffee. It's how fragile the entire system behind it actually is. Major changes rarely arrive with a bang. More often, they begin quietly, as familiar things slowly become less available over time. 11. Beef. Take a closer look at beef, and a deeper issue starts to come into view. In the United States, the cattle population has dropped to levels not seen in decades. Years of ongoing drought have worn down grazing land, reduced access to water, and driven up the cost of feed quite sharply. When natural pasture isn't enough to sustain the animals, ranchers are often forced to sell off parts of their herds sooner than they originally intended. Recovering from that kind of loss isn't quick or simple. Raising cattle follows a slow, natural cycle, first keeping young females, then waiting through breeding, raising the calves, and only eventually bringing them into the supply chain. This entire process takes years to unfold. It's not something that can be fixed in a matter of weeks or even months. As herd sizes decline, the supply of beef doesn't just dip temporarily, it becomes structurally tighter. Recent figures show that the total number of cattle and calves in the U.S. has fallen to its lowest point in roughly 75 years. When supply drops but demand doesn't fall at the same pace, prices tend to react almost immediately. That's exactly what's been happening. Ground beef prices, in particular, have surged to record highs during recent market shifts. The first items to disappear are usually the more affordable cuts, since that segment faces the most pressure. Beef itself doesn't vanish from store shelves, they still look full at a glance. But the range of choices isn't what it used to be. Lower-priced ground beef becomes harder to come by, steaks are cut thinner, package sizes shrink, and overall prices continue to climb. These changes don't happen all at once. They unfold gradually, almost quietly, avoiding any sudden sense of alarm. One man in his 60s shared that he had been buying the same ground beef for his weekend meals for years. Then, sometime last year, he noticed the package seemed lighter, even though the price hadn't really changed. A few months after that, the product he relied on was gone altogether. Only the more expensive option was left in its place. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He simply adjusted and started buying less. When the cheapest cuts disappear first, the real strain isn't visible on the shelf. It's happening behind the scenes, within the cost structure itself. For many households, beef is a staple source of protein. So when something that basic becomes less stable, the pressure on the food budget slowly increases. It's not because meat has disappeared, but because the same meals now cost more than they used to. The system doesn't suddenly break down. It tightens. And beef is one of the clearest examples of how that tightening becomes visible over time. 10. Cooking oil. Sunflower, canola, vegetable. Those clear bottles of cooking oil lined up on supermarket shelves seem so ordinary that you barely notice them. Yet behind each one is a complex supply chain that stretches across multiple countries and regions. When conflict disrupts the global flow of sunflower oil, prices react almost instantly. If drought cuts into canola harvests, the market tightens and becomes more sensitive. And as fuel and transportation costs gradually climb, those increases ripple through the system, pushing oil prices higher step by step. It doesn't take much, just one weak link, for the entire chain to start feeling unstable. Most people aren't tracking commodity markets or price charts, but they still notice the shift in more subtle ways. The bottle you picked up last year might have been 48 ounces. Now it's only 40. Yet the price hasn't really gone down. That budget-friendly brand you used to rely on shows up less frequently, and while the shelf still looks full, the variety has quietly shrunk. This isn't an obvious shortage, it's something more subtle. What you're seeing is a slow, quiet contraction. Cooking oil may not be the centerpiece of a meal, but it's essential to almost everything you prepare. Without it, frying, sautéing, or baking becomes difficult, if not impossible. So when oil prices rise, the cost of preparing food at home rises right along with them. As cooking becomes more expensive, everyday meals stop feeling as affordable as they once were. Eating out costs more, but staying in doesn't offer much relief either. There's no real escape from the increase. For those on a fixed income, a small percentage increase here and there might not seem urgent at first. But when several basic staples begin fluctuating at the same time, that financial cushion starts to wear thin. Cooking oil doesn't disappear, and it doesn't trigger panic buying. But when such a fundamental kitchen ingredient becomes unstable, the issue goes beyond flavor or convenience. It's a signal that the underlying system supporting it is under strain. Big changes rarely arrive suddenly or dramatically. More often, they begin quietly, as everyday essentials become incrementally more expensive. Nothing is completely gone, but with each passing year, you find yourself paying more for the same meal. That's what a quiet contraction looks like. 9. Infant formula. A few years back, something seemingly isolated revealed a much bigger issue. When a major production plant was forced to shut down due to investigations and product recalls, infant formula began disappearing from shelves in many areas within just a few weeks. It wasn't the whole store, and it wasn't every product, just one category, specifically for infants. But that alone was enough to create serious concern. Infant formula isn't made in countless small facilities spread out across the country. Instead, most of the supply comes from a small number of large-scale plants, many of which operate close to full capacity to keep costs low and prices competitive. When even one of these facilities temporarily stops production, whether for safety checks or quality concerns, it can't simply restart overnight. The process involves careful inspections, testing, and gradual redistribution, all of which take time. At the same time, modern retail systems tend to keep inventory levels low as a cost-saving measure, which means shortages can show up very quickly when something goes wrong. There's also another reality that any parent or caregiver immediately understands. Not every baby can safely consume just any formula. Some infants rely on highly specific formulations designed for allergies, digestive sensitivities, or medical conditions. When that exact product is unavailable, there isn't an easy backup option. There's no waiting it out for a few weeks, and there's very little margin for trial and error. One grandmother once shared her experience saying, "I raised 3 children, and I never imagined there would come a day when I'd have to drive from store to store just to find the right formula for my grandchild." Her words don't reflect panic. They reflect something deeper: instinct. The instinct to protect. If it were your own grandchild in that situation, You wouldn't sit back and wait for supply chains to recover. You would start searching immediately. Infant formula highlights how effective the modern system can be when everything is running smoothly. But it also exposes a critical weakness. High efficiency doesn't necessarily come with built-in layers of backup or resilience. Shelves may appear fully stocked most of the time, but it only takes a small disruption, a fraction of the time, for people to start questioning how stable things really are. And when a product as essential as infant formula depends on just a few concentrated production sources, it raises an uncomfortable possibility. The reliability we've come to expect may not be as permanent as it seems. 8. Cocoa. Real chocolate. Let's talk about cocoa, the foundation of real chocolate. Global cocoa prices have climbed sharply in recent years, largely because production in West Africa has taken a significant hit. Countries like Ghana and Ivory Coast, which together supply the majority of the world's cocoa, have been dealing with repeated challenges: unpredictable rainfall, extended periods of high heat, and persistent crop diseases. When so much of a global supply depends on a single region, any disruption in that area leaves the market with very little flexibility to adapt. Cocoa trees don't produce overnight. They take years to grow and mature. So when output drops, it's not something that can be quickly replaced in the next season. No amount of money can speed up the natural growth cycle of a tree. As supply tightens, the entire chocolate production chain connected to it begins to shift and adjust. I noticed this change in a very simple, personal way. Toward the end of last year, I picked up a familiar box of chocolate to bring to my grandchild's home for the holidays. Right away, something felt different. The price was noticeably higher, and the chocolate itself was smaller, even though the packaging looked almost identical. There was no label explaining a cocoa shortage, no announcement, just a quiet sense that you were paying more and getting a little less. Chocolate isn't a necessity for survival, but it holds a place in tradition and memory: holiday gifts, Easter treats, dessert after a shared meal. So when something tied so closely to family moments begins to change, because of weather patterns halfway across the world, it stops being just about a simple indulgence. I'm not someone who stocks up excessively on chocolate, but I have started choosing options with higher real cocoa content while prices are still within reach, keeping a modest and steady supply at home. It's not driven by fear, but by awareness. When an ingredient with such a long production cycle starts to show strain, it suggests the system behind it no longer has the same buffer it once did. A single chocolate bar won't bring the system down. But when small, familiar things begin to shift first, history suggests that larger changes often follow not long after. 7. Sugar. Sugar almost never vanishes from store shelves. It's still there, right where you expect it to be. That familiar white bag looks unchanged on the outside, but what supports it is a supply chain far more complicated than most people realize. Both sugarcane and sugar beets depend heavily on stable weather conditions to produce strong yields. When drought lingers or rainfall becomes unpredictable, production quickly starts to decline. As output drops, supply immediately comes under pressure. Then there's the refining process, which requires a considerable amount of energy. When fuel costs rise, the expense of processing sugar rises along with it. Because sugar is produced in large volumes with relatively small profit margins, even transportation costs play a direct role in shaping the final price you see in stores. And when certain countries decide to limit exports to protect their own domestic supply, the global market tightens almost overnight. But the real issue isn't just that the price of a bag of sugar increases slightly. Sugar isn't only something you stir into your coffee. It plays a much bigger role in the food system. It preserves jams and canned fruits, gives baked goods their structure, and helps balance flavors in sauces and processed foods. So when sugar becomes more expensive, the effects ripple outward through the entire food chain. Candy prices go up, sauces become more costly, and even canned goods start to reflect those increases. Inflation doesn't always arrive with obvious warning signs. It often spreads quietly through essential ingredients like this one. I noticed it myself last summer when I planned to make a few jars of jam, something I've done for years. The price of sugar had clearly gone up. Not dramatically, but enough to stand out. The packaging looked the same and the weight hadn't changed much, but the total cost of making a single batch of jam was noticeably higher. I didn't stop making it, but I did start keeping a small, consistent supply in the kitchen. not out of panic, but simply to avoid being caught off guard if prices climbed again. For many people, especially those in their 60s, sugar is tied to memories, summer jam making, holiday baking, preserving fruit for the colder months. So when such a basic ingredient behind those traditions begins to rise in cost due to weather, energy, and transportation pressures, the impact feels broader than just a number on a price tag. This kind of change doesn't come from one dramatic event. It builds gradually as multiple factors push costs upward at the same time. Sugar itself doesn't trigger a crisis, but it quietly makes everything around it more expensive. And when foundational ingredients like this start to rise, inflation doesn't need to be loud to spread. It works its way in subtly. Do you still make jam or bake the way you used to? Or have you found yourself scaling back as costs continue to climb? 6. Eggs. There was a stretch of time when egg prices surged dramatically in just a few months, largely because avian flu outbreaks forced the culling of millions of laying hens. This didn't happen because food suddenly disappeared. It happened because of how modern production is structured. Today's system relies heavily on massive, large-scale farms. So when disease hits, it doesn't affect a small number of birds. It impacts millions at once. Eggs might seem like one of the simplest items in the store, but behind them is a tightly concentrated system built on large facilities, dense populations, and maximum efficiency. That efficiency works well when conditions are stable. But when something goes wrong, like the spread of disease, the system has very little room to absorb the shock. Hens can't simply produce more eggs on demand. And replacing a lost flock isn't immediate. It takes time for new hens to grow and reach consistent production levels. Eggs aren't considered a luxury. They're one of the most affordable and accessible sources of protein for many households. They're a quick breakfast, a key ingredient in baking, and often a go-to option when budgets are tight. When meat becomes more expensive, many families naturally turn to eggs as an alternative. But when egg prices rise at the same time, that safety net starts to disappear. I remember walking into a grocery store and seeing the egg section nearly empty. It wasn't a full system breakdown. It was simply a moment when the supply chain couldn't adjust quickly enough. People in their 60s didn't panic at the sight, but they recognized something important. If even the most affordable protein source can fluctuate so sharply, then stability can't be taken for granted anymore. I'm not someone who stocks up excessively on eggs, but I did start thinking differently, adding more variety to the protein sources in my kitchen instead of depending too heavily on just one. Because when one essential item becomes unstable, it often sets off a ripple effect. Eggs are more than just a breakfast staple. They can act as an early signal of how resilient the overall food system really is. Do you remember when egg prices peaked? How did it affect the way you planned meals at home? A single 10% increase might go unnoticed, but when several everyday items rise by that same margin at once, it stops looking like coincidence. 5. Canned tuna. Canned tuna has always been a reliable fallback protein for many households. It doesn't need refrigeration, requires no real preparation, and with a simple pull of the lid, you've got something ready to eat. When beef becomes too expensive, people often shift toward tuna. And when money gets tight, it tends to feel like a dependable, budget-friendly option. But tuna isn't something that can be produced more quickly just because demand increases. It's a wild-caught resource, shaped by international fishing quotas and the overall health of marine ecosystems. When limits are put in place to protect fish populations, there's no way to suddenly increase supply to match rising demand. Fuel costs also play a bigger role than most people realize. Long-distance fishing vessels burn large amounts of diesel, and when fuel prices climb sharply, many fleets cut back on trips or reduce their operations to avoid losing money. The result isn't a complete disappearance of supply, but a gradual tightening, especially in the lower-priced options. Most consumers aren't watching fishing quotas or tracking fuel prices. Instead, they notice smaller cans, slightly higher prices, and value packs selling out more quickly than before. Meanwhile, premium tuna remains available on the shelf, but the more affordable choices become harder to find. Unlike livestock, tuna populations can't be replenished in a matter of months. If catch limits are reduced or fleets scale back, there's no quick way for the market to compensate. That's simply the natural constraint of this type of protein. I used to think canned tuna was one of the most stable items you could keep in your pantry, But when fuel costs rose and fishing regulations tightened at the same time, I started to reconsider that assumption. Now, I keep a reasonable amount on hand, but I don't rely on it as my only backup option anymore. Tuna itself doesn't trigger alarm or panic. But when even a backup protein begins to react quickly to energy costs and supply limits, it puts quiet pressure on a household's budget. And when the most affordable options stop feeling as steady as they once did, the issue goes beyond the ocean. It becomes part of a much larger story. 4. Frozen vegetables. Frozen vegetables seem like one of the most stable items in the grocery store. Bags of peas, broccoli, or pre-cut mixed vegetables almost always appear ready for purchase. But behind that seemingly steady freezer aisle lies a supply chain far more delicate than most people realize. The production of frozen vegetables relies on tightly timed harvests. Once a crop is ready, it must be washed, cut, blanched, and frozen almost immediately to maintain quality. If irregular weather reduces yields, the supply of raw produce tightens instantly. There's no backup warehouse holding extra fresh ingredients. Once the harvest window closes, it's gone. Then there's the matter of electricity. The cold chain, from processing plants to distribution centers to supermarket freezers, depends entirely on continuous, uninterrupted freezing. When energy costs rise, so do storage expenses. If a processing plant faces operational disruption or labor shortages, lost output cannot be quickly replaced. Shoppers rarely see these issues on the news. Instead, they notice the impact in a subtle way. The vegetables they usually buy start disappearing. The freezer isn't empty, but there's less variety, fewer brands, and fewer affordable options. I experienced this one winter when I went looking for the vegetable mix I normally buy. The freezer was still stocked, but the exact mix I wanted had vanished. There was no public announcement, just a quiet contraction of choices. Frozen vegetables were once a reliable fallback when fresh produce was too expensive or out of season. But when one of the three critical elements, harvest, electricity, or processing capacity, faces disruption, the first thing to disappear is variety. The vegetables themselves don't vanish, but a shrinking selection signals that the cold chain behind them no longer has the same buffer it once did. Have you noticed fewer frozen vegetable options in your usual supermarket compared to a few years ago? 3. Perishable fresh produce. Tomatoes, onions, lemons. These are some of the most basic staples in any kitchen. You can still buy them, shelves remain stocked, but their prices can swing dramatically in just a few weeks. Fresh produce is more directly tied to weather than almost any other food group. A prolonged heat wave can reduce tomato yields, heavy rain can damage onions, and an unexpected frost can wipe out an entire lemon crop. When a key growing region experiences extreme conditions, supply drops almost immediately because these items can't be stored long-term like grains can. Unlike canned or frozen goods, fresh produce has very little buffer. The supply chain, from field to supermarket, is short and tightly timed. If the harvest is weak or transportation is delayed, prices respond quickly. One week, tomatoes might be inexpensive, the next, nearly double the price. It's rarely due to a global crisis. Often, it's simply that one crop was affected. I first noticed this during a sudden spike in lemon prices. They weren't gone, but the increase was enough to make me pause every time I added them to my cart. These small week-to-week fluctuations don't make headlines. They show up quietly on weekly receipts. Fresh produce forms the foundation of a healthy meal. As climate patterns become more unpredictable, these foods react fastest to changes, not disappearing entirely, but becoming far less stable. And when even the simplest, most familiar ingredients start shifting week by week, kitchen stability no longer comes from routine. It comes from adaptability. Have you noticed tomato, onion, or lemon prices changing more sharply compared to a few years ago? 2. Dried beans. Dried beans are one of the most affordable and reliable sources of protein in a middle-class kitchen. They don't need a freezer, aren't dependent on a cold chain, and have a long shelf life. When budgets tighten, many families naturally turn back to beans. But beans aren't completely immune to pressure from agriculture. Their production depends heavily on weather conditions, irrigation, water availability, and the cost of fertilizer. When droughts persist or input costs spike, the area planted with beans can shrink. beans often aren't the most profitable crop for farmers. So when fuel and fertilizer prices rise, growers may choose to plant something that promises a higher return instead. Because beans operate on thin margins, even minor changes in production or transportation costs quickly show up in retail prices. There's very little cushion. When bean prices climb, it's not because people suddenly want luxury items. It's a reflection of stress in the agricultural system behind them. I noticed this myself when the bag of beans I usually buy became more expensive. Meat prices had already risen, and now even beans were creeping up. Not doubling or shocking, but enough to catch my attention. Beans have long been the stable option when everything else starts costing more. But when even that reliable choice begins to rise, a household's financial breathing room gradually narrows. I don't stockpile dozens of bags, but I do keep a moderate supply and rotate it regularly. Beans aren't a temporary substitute. They form the foundation of many family meals. They're not a luxury, they're a base layer. And when the foundation starts to wobble, the layers above it struggle to stay balanced for long. Do you still see beans as the most economical choice for family meals the way you once did? 1. Wheat flour. Wheat isn't just another ingredient. It's the foundation of bread, pasta, cookies, batter, and hundreds of dishes in a typical family kitchen. When wheat prices fluctuate, the effect doesn't stop at one shelf. It ripples across the entire food system. Wheat is influenced by a variety of factors: conflict in major producing regions, fertilizer costs, which rely heavily on natural gas, fuel for farm machinery, and international transport expenses. If even one of these factors spikes, production costs rise. When several increase at the same time, the market reacts quickly. Unlike fresh foods, wheat can be stored, but the global supply still depends on a few key regions. When exports are disrupted or drought reduces output, futures prices climb long before consumers see the impact. A few months later, those increases show up in flour and bread prices. I became aware of just how dependent we are on wheat when bread prices kept climbing steadily over a year. Not suddenly, but step by step. The familiar bag of flour cost more, loaves were smaller, and packaging looked almost the same. There was no label warning of a wheat shortage, just higher foundational costs slowly spreading through the system. Wheat forms the base of the simplest meals. When that base shakes because of conflict, fertilizer, fuel, or transportation issues, the consequences don't stop at one product. They reach every family budget. I don't overstock, but I keep a steady supply of flour and rotate it regularly, because when a foundational ingredient fluctuates, the effects often last longer than a single season. Wheat isn't just a grain, it's a gauge of the resilience of the entire food system. And when that gauge shifts, everything built on it shifts as well. Preparing isn't about panic. It's about staying calm. You don't need to fill an entire room with supplies. You just need to understand what the true foundations are. The shelves are still full, but the choices are quietly changing. If today you could pick only 3 items from this list to keep as a backup, which ones would you choose? This isn't about fear. It's about calm, thoughtful preparation.